Hello, it's Linda Hancock here. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which my university stands, the land of the Wurundjeri tribe of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Before beginning, I would also like to thank Biagio Giannetti and also Fernando Lopez for the honour bestowed on me of the Senior Researcher Award of the International Workshop on Advances in Cleaner Production. So it is in fact very much an honour to give this keynote speech today. So I'm going to talk about interdisciplinarity and what political science can bring to electromaterials, solar, batteries, and hydrogen. So in doing this, I'm coming to this talk as a political scientist, which might strike some people as quite unusual, not only in this forum, but also in scientific projects. I've just come to the end of, coming to the end of 6 years on a Centre for Excellence on Electromaterials Science. And I have a background in teaching policy analysis, social policy, European politics. I've run a corporate citizenship research unit with some of the major banking, mining and finance corporates in Australia. And I've had a number of governor and council ministerial appointments around different policy areas. So what is someone like me doing on a project on electromaterials science? Well, on the energy, our project has 25 chief investigators. It's funded by the Australian Research Council, and it has over 200 members and 25 chief investigators. So I'm a member of the team that is on ethics, policy and public engagement, and particularly looking at the energy side of things. There are two main foci on the project, biotech on the one hand, energy on the other. So I'm going to be focusing on the energy side. And in our team, we have people trained in philosophy, political science, international relations, social policy and political economy. And so I'm focused on the prospect of linking research scientists in the centre from chemistry, engineering, supply chain management, computer modelling, to the sort of work and the sort of questions that we ask in social sciences, and particularly around social, health, political, environmental and policy impacts related to renewables. And so a lot of these ethical issues are becoming very prominent, a lot more prominent perhaps than they were 5 years ago. And as we go into these transitions, are they ethical? And there's a number of questions that we've asked in our work over the last 6 years. And so I'm going to draw on some examples from that. The first one's about lab ethical procurement in research laboratories and looking at device system design for circularity from the point of view of materials. Then I'm going to look at some research I conducted in Bolivia on lithium and looking at public-private partnerships and some of the governance aspects of policy there. Then some examples from work done on Australian hydrogen research. We have a hydrogen lab and scientists, very award-winning scientists like Doug McFarlane on the ammonia and hydrogen research. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some of the analysis of power and interests, because when it comes down to a lot of the things that we look at as political scientists, how do we get ethical policy? How do we have just transitions? So these are some of the questions that are very important to us. So firstly, in the lab, this was the first research that we undertook around ethical procurement and looking at conflict minerals, the tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, and also critical materials. These are materials that in recent years, particularly the last decade, have become integral and important to renewable energy, materials like lithium that are key to for example, batteries and so on. So what is the regulatory environment for these, and how do we design end products, and what's the supply chain? And also what additional issues might be raised with nano applications and transmaterialization. So we published in the highlighted article there, but I'll tell you more of what we did. So basically our method was to look at laboratory supplies at the universities in our project, looking at solvents, minerals, and battery component supplies in this case. And we then identified some by supplier packaging, looking through the shelves in the labs, and also key suppliers were identified from an analysis of 1 year of purchase orders at 2 of the universities in our project. And we also did supply analysis on 4 supply companies who are key to supplying our labs. And so Sigma Aldrich, Merck, Germany, Tigray, Stremen Chemicals, and MTI Corporation. And so we looked at their policies and their approaches to transparency, accountability, human rights, environmental and ethical probity, and looking for toxic materials also that might be generated after supply, but during production. We also looked at regulatory analysis, OECD, US Dodd-Frank Act, and from 2015 onwards, the European Parliament and European Commission have been very active in the critical and conflict materials areas. So these methods were raising questions about the geopolitical stability of supplier countries, the geological scarcity of materials, the level of concentration of resources by individual companies or countries, and the methods of recovery. And so, as you can see, it was a cross-disciplinary publication for this work. And so after that, I suppose one of the interesting things we found from in the lab, for example, was that a lot of young research scientists are given samples by companies. And so that raises some ethical issues. You know, might it influence the research you do, or might it also give you some obligations to companies, for example, that give you free things? So I'll come back to that issue in the last part of the talk. Anyway, the next piece of research I will talk about was based on Bolivia and the promise of vertically integrated renewable energy battery industry. And we called it Bolivia's Lithium Frontier. I mean, going back in time, Morales, formerly a coca industry boss, but he has had numerous terms as head of the government in Bolivia, and put forward this model of involving overseas partners to assist Bolivia in the development of a vertically integrated mineral to product development and battery production model, which would be based on using their own lithium salts from high up in the altitude in their country in the Salar. And so we looked at, we used methods of documentary analysis, reports, and key stakeholder interviews in Bolivia. And we were interested too in how these public-private partnerships might link up with the UN SDGs. And we looked at the principles involved for an evaluative framework. And I suppose what came out of it was that there are a lot of barriers to developing countries like Bolivia to integrated renewable battery chains of supply. And one of the principal ones is who they partner with and who ends up doing the exploration. And at this point in time, the PPPs have not eventuated in a robust battery industry, and it's still quite fledgling. So, you know, in this we looked at, well, what are the barriers, and how also in later work we've looked at how various international bodies might assist developing countries in developing their nascent industries and having their own autonomous supplies. So I'll move on to looking at a number of articles where we looked at Australia's energy export potential around the notion of energy security. And so we looked firstly, I'll go through these in more detail, solar generated electricity exports to Indonesia via subsea cable, also ammonia and hydrogen exports to fuel Japan's hydrogen economy. And then the last example looks at the latest European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism in relation to two countries, Australia as an exporter and Germany as an importer. And so we're looking at here at the new wave of transnational renewable exports. And, you know, what does this new economy where solar, wind and hydro might be used to ship or send ammonia or electricity to across borders as exports. And so firstly, I mean, I'm focusing on Australia here because our project is Australian, but also Australia has the capacity to be a superpower, and it has natural endowments of solar intensity and also a skilled workforce. And so we've been focusing here on these natural endowments and then the potential for more research in this area. And also it's very appropriate that Australia might go down the hydrogen path, because not only is hydrogen identified as a fuel or a carrier, very important to heavy industry and heavy transport and things like rail and trucking and logistics, but Australia has one of the highest per capita CO2 emissions, and we're at the same time also reliant on coal-fired electricity and a major contributor to per capita emissions globally, as well as big exporters, amongst the biggest of coal, iron ore and gas. So big energy have been dominating our own policy debates, and also government subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So investment in energy R&D in Australia, like many other countries who are reliant on fossil fuels, favours the coal industry and the push on things like clean coal, carbon sequestration, clean gas. Well, how clean are they? And how much does something like CCS work? And I might add, Australia has been recently castigated in Glasgow this month at the COP26 for its lack of a new national determined contribution for 2030 above its very low commitment of a reduction of 24 to 26% on 2005 levels, one of the lowest in the developed world. And also its refusal to sign up to the methane reduction because, well, partly because of agriculture, but also because of gas exports. And gas exploration is still being ramped up in Australia. It's not stopping despite global, other global leaders moving to no more coal, no more new coal, or no more new gas. The Minerals Council has been identified too as having a very visible pro-coal and gas lobbying presence at the COP26. So here's the global map of global solar energy. You can see Australia does have potential to be a solar and renewable superpower because of this solar irradiation and also these as part of the natural endowment. So the key questions that we've looked at, firstly in this exporting electricity to Indonesia paper, energy security across political borders, geopolitical issues, and the question of whether nationally focused energy security frameworks are fit for purpose in this new context. And of course they're not. And so that's what we've developed. Also, we were looking in particular in terms of our method at a pilot project put forward by the Pilbara Development Commission in Western Australia to develop solar generated electricity to export them via subsea cable to Indonesia. And the project has spawned pilots in mining projects previously on diesel. And some of these are considerably big projects with industrial scale solar generation of energy. And also Indonesia's one of the largest energy consumers in the ASEAN. And so there's demand and supply strengths on both sides. This slide here just represents some of the solar farm export corridors between Australia and Indonesia. And so how we went about this, again, a literature review looking through the fields of energy and social sciences, political science and international political economy, identifying over 50 articles plus monographs that we subjected to analysis, and also industry reports and intergovernmental organisations like the World Bank and main energies, including Journal of Cleaner Production, Energy Policy, ERSS, and so on. And what emerges out of this review is that there's no consensus on the definitional dimensions of energy security, but certainly that we need frameworks that are fit for purpose for the sorts of issues that we're now facing with regard to transnational renewable energy, cross-border trade. And so in an era of climate change and disruptive technology, we looked at socio-technical transitions as one of the conceptual frameworks. And also we developed an energy security taxonomy that took into account geopolitical and foreign policy issues in a new sort of way, and looking at human security issues. And so the key points here are around the fact that geopolitically and economically, Australian governments need to strengthen the drive to be a potential renewable superpower, but also that cross-border electricity grids, the way these can be used for in building on and strengthening both the importer and exporter foreign policy goals and geopolitical cooperation, and how promoting a solar industry with this sort of export supports forward-thinking strategies to replace dependence on fossil fuels. And so as part of that research, we put forward the development of a 5-dimension framework on energy security that we then extended in the next project to a 6-dimension framework. So in the next project, we looked at Japan's hydrogen economy and its demands for hydrogen imports. And we analysed a project in Victoria in the southeast of Australia based on generating hydrogen from lignite brown coal through a gasification process and using that heat source to manufacture hydrogen, which would then be exported to Japan. And this goes back over 10 years with high-level agreements between the Japanese, Australian and Victorian governments. And of course, Japan has set goals for increasing the number of vehicles and households run on hydrogen fuel cells. And so Japanese companies involved in this project have partnered with Kobe City to build a hydrogen import hub. And so the controversial part of this project is not only is there a lot of carbon emitted during the gasification process using dirty brown lignite coal, but also the project is predicated on the success of carbon capture and storage. Now, it has undertaken a pilot, and the pilot did not sequester any of the carbon into carbon capture and storage. So in the research we've done, we've highlighted through analysis of global CCS research how this is still a very expensive form of technology, how it is still a long way off. And you have industry leaders like Twiggy Forrest, who's CEO of Fortescue Metals, giving a lot of public airing to his views at Glasgow COP26 that CCS is going to take too long, be too expensive, and we ought to forget it. And that we ought to be focusing more on solar fuels rather than trying to have business as usual with carbon-based coal or gas-generated hydrogen. So this project did raise a lot of questions about Japan's commitment to zero carbon if these exports end up not having successful application of carbon capture and storage. And it also raises issues of just transitions when assessing global emissions impacts of this sort of technology. And so just to reinforce the current energy reliance on imports of Japan, it gets 67% of its coal from Australia. And obviously too, for Australia, Japan is a major customer. So a lot of the Gippsland project is perhaps predicated upon keeping coal going whilst trying to sequester some of the emissions. But at the moment, that's looking, as I said, very unlikely. So in terms of the energy justice framework, which I'm going to explain more at the end, we did add these questions put by Chirp and Jewel in their research: security for whom? Security for which values? Security for what threats? And so looking at the Gippsland brown hydrogen, how does it stack up on these questions when compared with solar generated hydrogen? And I might add that there's a window of opportunity here to contribute as exporters for anyone around the world to Japan's hydrogen economy, because perhaps the best future self-reliance on renewables for Japan might lie in offshore wind, but in the near term, it's focused on its hydrogen economy. And Renew Economy recently stated Australia's the world's third largest energy exporter. It's all fossil fuels and it all goes to Asia. If Asia goes green, Australia needs to change. So in terms of the next slide, it points to the question of whether Gippsland brown hydrogen could be stranded energy once the rest of the world or our importers start to say, no, we need green and we need renewables. So the third hydrogen project I look at is the impact of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism on Australian exports of hydrogen with varying carbon emission profiles. This work has been done with Linda Hancock, who's also going to talk at the conference. Now, the potential impact is something that we became interested in because the EU CBAM is the first mechanism for a transnational carbon border tax. They are at pains to say it's not a tax, but it will function like a tax in the sense that those exporting goods to the EU that are high in carbon will end up having to pay an adjustment fee. And so that is going to be a major impost, and it's also triggering a lot of debate globally around global carbon certification and their has been a lot of discussion about this being very imminent, because the CBAM is going to be implemented across 5 key industries that are highly polluting in terms of the inputs to the EU by 2023. And so this research, we feel, addresses a gap because there's little written on the new opportunities and risks posed by CBAM-like mechanisms. And it also triggers demands for global carbon certification. So in this study, we look at 2 import-export case studies. We look at Australian brown, blue and green hydrogen exports to the EU with company case studies in each category. And then we look at Germany importing blue and green hydrogen and some company case studies. Now, this slide is of little use, but it actually just summarizes some of the underlying values and the components of the 7 dimensions of the energy security framework. And so when I show you the risk and opportunity analysis of the Australian projects, we looked firstly in terms of brown hydrogen at the previous research and updated on the Latrobe Valley Gippsland lignite brown hydrogen. Then we looked at Santos, major corporation, largest LNG exporter in Australia and globally, I think, and its Cooper Basin South Australian project, which again is one of these projects where they're talking about clean hydrogen, but only because it's gas with carbon capture and storage, which again is not implemented at this stage. And then we compare those two to green hydrogen in 2 projects, one at Gladstone, both solar electrolyzing hydrogen projects, one in Gladstone and one in Townsville, both in Queensland. So this 7-dimension framework looks at availability, affordability, technology development and efficiency, environmental and social sustainability, regulation and governance at national and international level, just and ethical socio-technical energy transitions, and lastly, supranational carbon mechanisms and their impacts on trade. And so what we've done in this matrix for each of, as part of the research, is point out the opportunities and risks. And a quick glance at the table in front of you does show that the opportunities are far more frequent for the green hydrogen. And we've been pointing out in the analysis, which, by the way, was an invited article for a 2021 edition of the journal Energies. And in the next slide, I show you the similar analysis of risks and opportunities of blue and green hydrogen in Germany as an importer. Of course, there are some risks for importers of even the green, in the sense that while it creates an opportunity, there's also going to be some administrative imposts on importers who are going to have to figure out the import CBAM. But essentially, it's similar to the Australian analysis and points to the potential for the green renewables economy, and also contributes for other researchers, an energy security framework that goes beyond econometric demand and supply, and that includes just and ethical and carbon diplomacy mechanisms. So I now turn to the last part of the paper, where I include power and interests analysis, because so much of what I've been talking about is railing against, in Australia, what are called the carbon wars, and the fact that we have an intransigent national government wedded to the fossil fuel industry, as I said before, still giving subsidies to fossil fuels and slowly increasing its support of renewables, but nowhere near as it could or perhaps should. And so how does this come about? and why does it happen? And so in some work that goes for me back 20 years, I have used some taxonomies developed by tobacco researchers at University of Bath on corporate political activity analysis. Now, this framework has been applied to a lot of the global harms industries: gambling, alcohol, tobacco, sugar foods, and it's incredibly useful because what it does is give some tools of analysis to look at the emperor with no clothes, to take industry and government arguments in favour of maintaining harmful commodities or harmful systems like high carbon energy systems, and how it favours business as usual. And so what this research does is it has come up with 9 framing strategies and 26 tactics or rhetorical claims used by the gambling industry to influence government regulation, which are then applied to big energy. And these are information management via lobbying, shaping the evidence base, constructing a narrative of negative unintended consequences, like, we'll lose jobs and so on. Policy substitution and regulatory redundancy, like we don't need these new rules. Constituency building, it's alliances with other emitters and so on. Constituency fragmentation and destabilisation. Financial incentives in favour of the status quo, like subsidies, legal actions and threats, and the invocation of how responsible we all are around industry and corporate social responsibility. So we've applied this framework to big energy submissions to the energy pricing inquiry in Australia as a validation technique. So in terms of analysis here, I'm trying to give you a flavour of, I guess, what we see we can contribute to the debates within which the natural or hard sciences are creating inventions and devices and systems. And so we're looking here at energy justice and just transitions. There are notions of path dependence to help explain why we're stuck with the same policies and business as usual, but also the opportunity of path creation, highlighting the agency of entrepreneurs who at least partly define the flow of transition events. And so just to conclude, and I hope I haven't kept you too long, I want to conclude on some comments about how we demonstrate impact of the natural and the social sciences. The natural sciences publish more frequently, you have shorter papers, you have bigger teams, and we often write articles that are 8,000 to 15,000 words. And I know for the outputs and the contributions and the impact of our own Centre of Excellence, we've got over 85,000 citations, and there are 53 patents that have been filed. There's the biofabrication cluster, there's the biofab ACMD facility at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, there's the Aquahydrex spin-out company, there are patented devices. So how do we in the social sciences demonstrate impact? Because, we're often trying to contribute to debates. We make media appearances, we do submissions, of course we do publications, and we try to influence policy by pointing out what we find from objective, independent research. And we try to influence policy decisions. For example, the social harms area is a good example. These are commodities that are approved and regulated, but they are harmful. And you can say carbon is harmful to the global commons, if you want to use that. So here are some of the opportunities that PhDs in the project are working on. Matthew Cherian in India, looking at the design and development of disaster resilient energy systems in a developing country context, informing disaster policymakers. and first responders in developing country contexts, where there are opportunities to develop new policies, combine disaster response with COVID-19 response, and scale up investment in smart climate actions. Linda Wallachim, who's giving a keynote later, she's been looking at enabling low carbon community energy and the need to invest in localised energy production, supply chains and community engagement, and highlighting the importance of policy leadership on distributed energy with a comparison of Germany and Australia. And in my work, we've been looking at ethical supply chains in renewables, as I mentioned earlier, around critical and conflict minerals, but also looking at this lab to product design choice area and looking at how we can transform renewable supply chains more beneficially. And so a lot of our work goes into submissions, a lot of it is project presentations. For instance, within our project, we've developed the rule that our researchers need to include answers to the question, are there ethical issues that need to be raised in terms of your materials used? Who are the end users of your research, even along the line of potential products? And are there any ethical questions of cost or availability, etc.? But our significant outcome of our work was raising questions to the chemist on the use of these materials. There is one, however, research impact that we're rather proud. Deakin University has installed an industrial scale 5 megawatt solar system down in its Warren Ponds Victorian campus. Excuse me. And it's put in a 2 megawatt battery. Now, this battery does not contain cobalt. It meets technical storage efficiency and cost criteria over the long term, in some ways better than a bank of lithium batteries. And it's a first for an Australian utility scale microgrid battery without cobalt. Now, that did come about, I am told, as a direct result of our research. And so that's been very gratifying. And so lastly, I'd like to show you who's in our team across the ethics, policy and public engagement. So for a project of 200, we're small, but we hope effective, and we hope that we've been able to raise some questions that raise other questions that prompt people to think. So I do want to thank you very much for bearing with me and for the invitation to speak. And thank you to the organisers in Italy and in Brazil for your wonderful organisation of this opportunity. And I'm really sorry that we're not meeting personally in Rome. We looked forward to that several years ago, but I wish everyone the best wishes during a global pandemic, where our big challenge in the areas we work in is coupling the recovery strategy to a transition to a carbon zero world. Thank you.